they were in this hot, steamy kitchen cleaning up, and the butter in the mashed potatoes started to melt. And so all of a sudden, these plops of mashed potatoes were falling on my mother and my aunt. And my mother was a super clean freak. She was like screaming, "Oh my God, what is mashed potatoes? How can I have mashed potatoes on me?" Welcome to the Knife Wife podcast. I'm Suz, married to Bob Terzuola. This podcast is about couples who live, love, and work together. And it has little to do with knives. Welcome to the Knife Wife podcast. I'm still working out on what to say at the beginning. Somebody help me. Anyway, here we are.
You could start with hello.
Hello. You say hello.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back.
Thanks. I'm trying to give people a break from toxic media. And because, oh boy, lately there's been a lot. I can't even take it anymore. I feel like a 5-year-old with her fingers in her ears going la, 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 so I can't hear the TV when it's on. It's just too much. Anyway, and on this podcast, it's about everything and nothing. And we answer questions that nobody asks. And so, what can I tell you? Today, we're going to have just Bob and I here. Not just Bob and I. Bob and I are the deal, but it's the two of us.
Yep.
Because of COVID, we lost our guests. So we have lots of stories to tell. And today, we're going to talk about family. And we came from very different families.
We certainly did.
Bob came from a Brooklyn Italian family, typical of the time, many people in the same house, many families. And Bob and I were realizing the other day, as he said that you said you had never had your own bedroom before, and you still don't.
I still don't.
And I always had my own bedroom.
I never had my own room.
Yeah. So, anyway, so you grew up in Brooklyn. I grew up in Chicago. Oh, not in Chicago, in the suburbs, the North Shore of Chicago, which pretty schwanky where I grew up. And we joke that we're from different collars. You're
blue.
I'm white. Together, it sort of blends nicely. It really does. I would have given anything as the only kid at home to have had a whole family like Bob did. And I want you to tell people, what was it like? Where did you grow up? And, how many people were there? I mean, you had more people in one house than I have in my entire family. So
actually, it sounds like it. Yeah.
It's true. So tell us about your house growing up.
Well, it was in Bay Ridge in Brooklyn, which was relatively, and still is, relatively posh and upper-class neighborhood.
And a little factoid about Bay Ridge. 50% of the population in 1950, so you were 6, was Italian. 50%.
And I think they were all living in my house.
Go on.
We had, I lived in a Dutch colonial-style house that was originally made for one family. And I grew up with seven cousins.
Right.
We were 7 cousins in the same house.
Right. So the one family was before the Depression. And then these were
all
all available at cheap prices after the Depression.
Right.
And so all these Italians.
And the only way we could afford to live there, the whole family, was that there were basically 4 families contributing to the upkeep of the house and the mortgage and so forth. My Aunt Rose and Uncle Tony, with 3 kids, lived on the ground floor. My grandmother and grandfather lived on the second floor. There were full kitchens and bedrooms and so forth. And my mother and father and I, and later my brother, we lived in the attic, in one half of the attic, which was actually one large room. We lived in one room until I was 13 years old.
And if anyone saw The Honeymooners, the old show, The Honeymooners with Ralph Crandon and funny show, black and white, they had an apartment in there that was one room with a bedroom. You never got to see the bedroom. But I picture you living in the Honeymooners apartment.
It was very similar, except they had a much more luxurious accommodations than we had. We had basic linoleum floors and so forth. The other half of the attic was occupied by my Uncle Angelo, my Aunt Helen, and their 3 children. And their half of the attic was actually furnished, and it had its own tile bathroom. We didn't have a bathroom where we were. Our bathroom was on the second floor. We were on the
That's
third
amazing
floor.
to me that I would have to go and use someone else's
And
bathroom.
they had a full kitchen and carpeting and so forth. But we were at the front end of the house, and we basically had not very much.
Mm-hmm.
My father built a partition when I was about 6 or 7 years old.
And why?
Kind of
What was the
separating.
partition for?
Well, it was a place to put books, and it was like a bookcase. It had a big opening and a bookcase, and the beds were on one side, and the kitchen, what you call a kitchen, we had a stove, we had a laundry sink, and a refrigerator, an old refrigerator, and that's what I lived in until I was 13 years old. But the joy was having a big family, and we had all these cousins. I was kind of in the middle. I had some older ones and some younger ones. And growing up in that part of Brooklyn was absolutely wonderful, and I really enjoyed it. And I had a lot of great memories.
A real community.
It was a community. It was a community. Even with the rest of the neighborhood, we had friends, and we go play ball. We played stickball using an old broom handle and a pink rubber ball in the street, or we'd go roller skating with our roller skates that clipped on to the bottom of your shoes. I don't know if anybody younger than 50 years old remembers them.
I had them, and I grew up in a town where they had brick streets.
Oh, well, that's pretty rough.
Which they caught in between the bricks. Yeah. And I didn't have knees without scabs on them till I was probably, stopped roller skating.
These roller skates had steel wheels, not wood. They weren't shoes. They weren't boots. They were basically metal plates, adjustable for longer and shorter feet. And they had clamps on the front. Then with a key, you stuck the key in a little slot, and it tightened the clamp around the front of your shoe. You wore regular street shoes. We didn't have sneakers very much in those days. They came later. And then there was a strap that went around your ankle, and that was our roller skate. And we skated in the streets. And
so you have a lot of great memories from there.
I did.
And you had a dad who was home a lot, actually, for his time.
And he spent a lot of time with me. We built things. We made things. I really enjoyed being with him. He taught me a great deal about using tools, making things. And one of my fondest memories was walking across the Brooklyn Bridge with him. I think I was probably around 10 years old. I would guess maybe 10. It was a long time ago, so forgive me. But I remember it was a beautiful day, and for no reason at all, he decided that it'd be a good idea to let's go walking across the Brooklyn Bridge. And we did, and we actually walked back into Brooklyn. We went from Brooklyn to Manhattan and back again. And years later, I took my two boys on the same trip, and we walked across the Brooklyn Bridge, Matt and Dan. And I'm really glad we did that. That was one of the great memories.
And Dan he has a picture of the three of you.
Several pictures, yes.
And he used that. We just found this out.
We just found this out, that he not only does he have the pictures, but he used one of those pictures to help get the American citizenship for his son, Dante, my first grandson, to show that, yes, they did grow up in the United States.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so in your day, and my day too, we walked a lot. I mean, people, maybe you rode your bike somewhere, maybe not, but like to school.
I was 11. I never had a bicycle till I was 11. That's another story.
Thing. Yeah. So you had to walk to school every day. I walked to school every day.
Right.
And they used to just have half-day kindergarten. You didn't go all day like now. The kids go all day. I feel sorry for them. They're tired. Those kids are so tired when they go to kindergarten.
It was probably half-day kindergarten.
Probably was.
I would walk. It was 5 city blocks in New York, which comes out to about a quarter of a mile, roughly a quarter of a mile, to school.
PS
185.
There you go.
It was a public school, 185.
Mm-hmm.
And I have several stories about that. Yes, I really did walk to school in the snow. It wasn't uphill both ways, but it was in the snow. And the first day that my mother took me to school, and we walked, I was in kindergarten. And the very first time I didn't want to go in the school, and I didn't want to leave her. But she said, it's okay, go ahead. And she says, I'll be right here when you come back. And in front of the school was a fence. And it was a fence made of vertical metal bars with big wide opening gates. It wasn't a cyclone fence. It was a very solid steel gate. Anyway, my mother was in one corner. She was on the left-hand corner. I'll never forget this. She was on the left-hand corner. And I went in, I walked up the steps and went and the teacher was there, and we went inside. And she said, don't worry, when you come out, I'll be right here. And she told me this, that when I came out, she said I burst into tears because she was no longer on the left-hand corner of the gate. She was standing at the right-hand corner of the gate. And I said, you moved.
And that is Bob in a nutshell right there. Okay? He doesn't like anybody moving anything. He doesn't like people to change. He says he has had a happy childhood, but things like that stick with us, and you like things where you know where they are. And that's really you in a nutshell. Yeah. So anyway, so you got older and you would go for a whole day, and we used to walk home for lunch.
I did. One of my stories is that I went home for lunch. I was probably, I think it was in the 3rd grade. It may have been 2nd grade. I was in the school until the 6th grade. But I'd go home for lunch every day. And for some reason, we were, like I said, on the 3rd floor in the attic. And there was a little landing right outside the door to our part of the attic. And for some reason or other, my mother and I got into an argument. I can't remember what it was, but we got mad at each other, and she was yelling at me, and I was yelling at her, and I got pissed off. And I got my books and walked out, and I think I slammed the door, probably did slam the door, and felt immediately guilty about that whole thing because I really did love my mother. So I turned back and opened the door at the inopportune moment that she had, in her frustration and anger, thrown a spoon at the closed door. But as I opened the door, the spoon was still in the air in mid-flight and hit me in the eye. It didn't hit me on the sharp corner or anything. It was the round portion. It just bounced off my eye.
The striking part of the spoon.
Yeah, exactly. So I didn't do anything. It didn't get any real damage, but I did get a little bit of a bruise, and she was very contrite, and I was very contrite, and she kissed me, and I hugged her, et cetera, et cetera. Walked back to school after lunch, and the teacher, who I believe that was the 3rd grade, that would have been Mrs. Mulady, she looked at me and she said, Robert, I was Robert in those days, said, Robert, what happened to your eye? And I looked at her and I said, my mother threw a spoon at me. And Mrs. Mulady looked at me and said, you must have done something really bad. Go take your seat.
And therein lies the difference between
then and now.
Then and now. That would never happen now.
Nowadays, they would have had the police. They would have had Child Protective Services. The mayor would have come down. My mother would have been in jail. We would have had a lawyer. Who knows?
Things are different now. But, and you had, at that school at PS 185, you told me another story once about it was winter and you were throwing snowballs at city buses with your friend, right?
Yeah, we actually did. There was a city bus that passed right in front of the school, actually. It was on 86th Street. And my friend Glenn and I decided that it would be fun to throw snowballs at the bus.
Hi, Glenn, if you're listening.
Yes, if
Glenn
you're
is
listening,
still
Glenn
Bob's
Collins.
friend from all those years back.
Yes. Anyway, we decided to throw snowballs at the bus, and we were having such a jolly time because the buses would come fairly frequently. Remember, we didn't have school buses in those days. Everybody got, if you were going to take a bus, you got on a city bus. So the buses were fairly frequent. We had a principal Her name was Mrs. Schindel, and she was the quintessential battle axe. Ugly, old, gray hair.
Dressed in a prison maiden suit, probably.
Yeah.
Like they were back then.
Skirt. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And Mrs. Schindel was tough, and she was our principal. Well, Glenn and I decided to throw these snowballs, and one bus passed by, and I threw a snowball, and lo and behold, one of the windows was actually open. And who was sitting in the seat by the open window? Mrs. Schindel, who looked out and recognized me.
That's some bad luck, baby.
This was after school, after 3 o'clock. So the next morning, my mother was summoned to school, and Mrs. Schindel related to her how I had thrown the snowball and that I should be behaving myself and that she should reprimand me and tell me never to do that again.
Did you ever do that again?
I never did that again. No.
In Chicago, we threw I played with all boys. In my neighborhood, they just had all boys. And so they would throw snowballs at cars. But a little different as one car, this kid I was playing with hit the car with the snowball, and the car pulled over, and the guy chased us down the street. A little different than your experience. Yeah. But, I was into some upper middle class, very suburban area, which you don't do such things.
So you didn't have any cousins that you grew up with in your house? It was
I do have cousins. I just found out through Ancestry.com, I have a new cousin, my only girl cousin, and we've met several times, and that's another story, but I'm delighted to have her. I had 3 cousins who two of them were much older than me, and the one that was closest to my age was 4 years older than I was. He was a handful. But I definitely had a different type of family. Like when you came into my house, there was a pillow on the couch, right, Bob?
Mm-hmm.
What did the pillow say?
And the pillow said, you can never be too thin. You can never be too rich.
You can never be too rich or thin. And as my friend in graduate school, when she came in the house, who was going to become a social worker, she looked at that pillow and she said, well, the rules are posted here. Anyway, so that's pretty much how we lived our life. And I did have the lovely holidays. I didn't have anybody, we only saw my family, my mother's family. My father's everyone was dead in his family, so there was really no one to visit. Nobody had any kids. But we went to Aunt Ray's and Uncle Lloyd's, and Aunt Ray was like, my brother said she was like knowing Santa Claus personally. Whenever she came over, she had a toy for you. Every week she would come pick me up. She would take me to the movies, or she would take me to a bookstore, and she bought me every Caldecott book. She really had a big influence on my life. But my family was, there was a lot of alcohol in my family, a lot of drinking. And they were, the martini toting, cigarette smoking of their era, that all white collar people. And that was glamorous to them. They didn't have your grandpa had a jug of homemade wine under the dining room table.
Uncle Tony and Grandpa.
Yeah. And they made it in the basement. That didn't happen at my house.
He had a big wine press in the cellar.
So cool. Yeah. So anyway, Aunt Ray's house, one year, I was pretty young because the dining room table, she had this center entrance colonial house, the dining room table was sort of full. We had grandmas and aunts and people who, not too many years after that, were no longer with us. So my youngest cousin and I had to sit in the kitchen and eat at the kitchen table. And my uncle had a tile company that he actually took over from my Aunt Ray's father, called the Ravenswood Tile Company in Chicago. And they had one of their biggest jobs their claim to fame was all the McDonald's that were red, white, and yellow with the arches. And they were all tiled, complete tiled, floor to ceiling tile, which is easy to clean if you have a restaurant. It's a good thing to have. And so their house had a lot of tile in it. Their house was like the Tile Mahal. And in the kitchen, they even had tile. They had all the way up the walls. On the ceiling, there were tiles. And so my cousin and I are sitting there, and I don't know. I like mashed potatoes. I didn't really want to part with mine. Gosh knows we didn't get those in my house. And my cousin was flinging them from a spoon up on the ceiling, trying to get in the middle of these tiles. And so a lot of mashed potatoes went on the ceiling, but no one was watching. The adults were together. And during this time, it was a very frequent occurrence. If my cousins are listening, they can corroborate this story. My uncle, we would have it would look like a Norman Rockwell painting. In fact, I brought a boyfriend there once. He said, "Does anybody ever get a cold or get sick here? I mean, they look perfect. They're all blonde-haired, blue-eyed, and well-dressed and whatever." And I'm like, well, what can I say? I don't know. We get colds. But anyway, so Uncle Lloyd would have the turkey on a maybe not a silver platter, but a fancy platter. And he would slice it and what do you want, dark meat or light meat or whatever. And then they were covered vegetable dishes and he would scoop out potatoes or vegetables, whatever. And for my cousins who remember this, my mother she was not a great cook. She brought tomato aspic, which is like gelatin with tomato juice in it. It is the most disgusting thing. Nobody ever ate the aspic. Everybody got it on their plates, but you never saw it go in anyone's mouth. But anyway, so Uncle Lloyd, I don't know why this would happen, that he'd start to slice the turkey and he would start to sneeze. And after about 10 sneezes, he would excuse himself from the table and he would go upstairs and my father would take over carving the turkey and doing this job. And you could hear Uncle Lloyd sneezing upstairs. So I remembered the potato incident of hearing him above me sneezing. And I mean, he would sneeze thousands of times. I mean, it was exhausting. And usually about the time we were about done with dinner, Uncle Lloyd's sneezing would stop and he'd come downstairs. And nobody ever said a word. This man was just sneezing in the background the whole time. We acted like, well, that's what everybody does. I mean, it happens at everybody's house. Nobody said a word. So the night of the mashed potatoes, my aunt and my mother and whoever else was cleaning up in the kitchen, and it was very steamy and hot, washing dishes most of them by hand. And of course, if you don't know this, I know this, you never put sterling silver in a dishwasher. So anyway, they were in this hot, steamy kitchen cleaning up, and the butter in the mashed potatoes started to melt. And so all of a sudden, these plops of mashed potatoes were falling on my mother and my aunt. And my mother was a super clean freak. She was like screaming, "Oh my God, what is mashed potatoes? How can I have mashed potatoes on me?" And she thought someone threw them at her. And then they looked up and they saw them on the ceiling. And they knew that what Danny had done. I thought it was a perfectly good waste of one of my favorite foods. But
did Danny do that all by himself?
I think I might have done it a few times, but I really was more interested.
That's what I thought.
Yeah, but no, I was more interested in eating them. What is my favorite thing to do? What's my comfort food? What's my comfort food? What do I always want?
Mashed potatoes.
Right. So you think I'm going to throw them on the ceiling when I could eat them?
I've never seen you throw them on the ceiling, though.
Well, you probably won't. Anyway, so Danny, he was always getting in trouble. But, that was sort of my family. And they were a lot of fun. We played games after dinner. We'd play games till 1 o'clock in the morning, board games. We played this game called Tripoli. And when I moved to California, the first thing we did was go and buy a Tripoli set and poker chips and played with everybody. I mean, we really had a good time. And it was nothing like, Italians in Brooklyn. Yeah. I was doing a little bit of research about Brooklyn because I found out there's a book called Bay Ridge Chronicles. And it's about Italians in the 1950s in Brooklyn, in Bay Ridge.
That was where I grew up.
Right. That was the second. And which house were you in, Bob, when the Parrot, Mrs. Thiels?
That was when I was probably 11, 12 years old. That was in Bay Ridge.
Mm-hmm. So Uncle Dominic gave you his old bicycle. Uncle Dominic, who's how old now?
Uncle Dominic, right now, he's 91 years old, God bless him, and he's still kicking.
And on his 90th birthday, he's a very New York liberal Italian, right?
Very liberal. Most of my family are so left-wing liberals, I just can't believe what they are. These people are, never mind. Anyway, we couldn't, they had a big party for Uncle Dominic.
Recently.
For his 90th birthday. It was 90th birthday. And they had hired a hall. And all of his children and grandchildren and the cousins and everybody all showed up. There were probably, 70 or 80 people there. But anyway, Susie and I couldn't make it. We had other things going. I couldn't remember what was going on. But anyway, what I did was I wrote a tribute to Uncle Dom. And
Talking about the bike, right? You talked about the
I
bike.
talked about the bike, and I talked about growing up, and when he was in the Army, he went into the Army. It would have been 1950, whatever, I don't know what. He was located at Fort Dix in New Jersey, and I remember one day Uncle Dominic came in his uniform, and he gave me a hand grenade. It was
A live one?
It was a blue hand grenade, which means it was inert. No, it was not a live one.
Just joking.
But I remember he gave that to me, and that was one of my prized possessions. But anyway, I recounted that story, and I wrote this down, and I sent a copy to his son, Charlie, just in case we couldn't make it or we couldn't make a connection. But I said, Charlie, what I'd like to do is read this to him myself. So I'm going to give you a call on your phone, and if it works out, go up to the microphone and put the phone next to it so that I can read it to Uncle Dominic myself. And he said, okay. And that's actually what worked out. It worked out very well. So I gave this little tribute, and I talked to Uncle Dominic. And I'm reminding everybody that he and everybody else in the room are extreme left-wing crazy liberals. I ended by saying, and Uncle Dominic, I want you to know that for your 90th birthday, in honor of you, I've made a substantial contribution to the Donald Trump re-election campaign.
That went over. They all laughed.
I could hear them all laughing and hooting and hollering and pounding the tables. That was Uncle Dominic. Anyway, he gave me his old bicycle when I was 11, taught me how to ride it, and that was a prized possession. We couldn't afford a bicycle. But, I used to ride around the neighborhood. I'd take the ferry to Staten Island, which was 5 cents at the time.
Can you imagine having a kid ride to the Staten Island ferry and take the Staten Island ferry alone today? It just never would happen.
No. That's a story I'm going to continue, but I want to say one other thing. You were talking about after dinner at your house, you would play board games and you'd have play. Okay, what we did was we ate. We were Italians, okay?
Well, we weren't allowed to eat in my house.
Let me explain this. This is important. This was a big house. It was 3 stories, and it was originally made for one family with servants. And in Aunt Rose's apartment down on the ground floor was a staircase, the back stairs. And the back stairs went all the way up, and then they went up to the attic also, where we lived. And Grandpa had made what was known as a victory garden. In those days, remember, this is right after World War II. Every family, especially Italians, had a victory garden. They grew vegetables. Mainly, Grandpa raised tomatoes and basil.
Wasn't a goal.
Yeah, great tomatoes. But anyway, Uncle Tony loved to cook, and he was a great baker. And they would get the fresh mozzarella delivered every day by the polio truck that would come by. It wasn't DoorDash.
I know. I said to him, well, it sounds like DoorDash to me. It's just that the store that you order from actually delivers to you. And so there was a watermelon guy. There was a milkman. There were all these things that people brought to you, right?
And good humor. The ice cream guy used to come by. But anyway, they'd go out in the backyard and get the tomatoes, slice them up, and they would make pizza. Now, this wasn't for dinner.
Right.
This was after dinner. When Susie's family was playing board games and maybe drinking, we were eating pizza.
You're on meal number 2. Which I would have preferred, let me tell you.
And Aunt Rose had a bellowing voice, and she'd open up the door to the back stairs, and she'd yell up, and she said, "Pizza!" And this would be like 10:30 at night. And we'd all troop downstairs, and we'd all go around her table, and we had this fresh, homemade pizza with homegrown tomatoes and basil, and it was like nothing ever tasted again. It was the best there was.
Yeah. We had maybe we had pizza twice a year.
But the bicycle, I want to tell you, finish off on the bicycle.
Tell me on the bicycle, because you went a lot of places, but the one time you
one time
meandered.
I was about, it would have been soon after I got the bicycle. I used to love riding it around. And because my mother and father, we were on the top floor, there was a window. And when it was time to go home, my mother would call out the window, "Robert," and I could hear her throughout most of the neighborhood because they were all one-family houses, except for one building on the corner of our block, which was about a 4 or 5-story apartment building. And on the ground floor of that apartment building, there was an old lady named Mrs. Thiel, Thiel.
She doesn't sound Italian to me.
No, she wasn't Italian. She was probably Norwegian, but who knows? Maybe German.
Yeah.
And she was on the ground floor, and by her window sat this parrot, a big parrot. And the parrot would talk. And my friend Glenn Collins lived right next door in the same apartment building. And I'd go to see them, and we'd talk to the parrot and say hi, and the parrot would look at us and say hi. Well, one day I decided to pedal my bicycle to the library, and I had never been to the library before. It was on 69th Street. We lived on 82nd Street. You do the math. That's how many blocks away it was. And I took out 2 books. One was, I signed up for the library. I didn't have to have a driver's license or an ID, but I got a little library card. I was 11 years old. And I got these 2 books. One of them was about Russian deep sea divers, and the other was a book called Danger Dinosaurs, my first science fiction book. It was a juvenile book. Both of them were written for juveniles. Anyway, I walked across. I took my bicycle across the street from the library, and there was a staircase going down the street from Ridge Boulevard, where I was, down to Colonial Road, and it was down a hill. Both sides of the staircase were lampposts, big lampposts. So I sat on the steps. This is about 5 o'clock in the afternoon, and I started reading. Well, I got so enthralled that it became dark, and I was a long way away from home. And my mother was outside the window, and she was calling me and calling me and calling me, and I didn't hear her, of course. She later recounted to me that they had everybody in the house out on the streets looking for me because it was dark and I wasn't home. I finally got the books and packed up and went home, and to the relief of everybody, they were all called back inside. But she said, while I was calling you, she could hear the parrot calling my name in her same voice. Robert. That's how she used to call me. And she said she just burst into tears because she could hear this ghostly parrot voice in the dark over the houses in Bay Ridge.
That's a great story, honey. I love that story. Anyway, you were in quite a community. We have so much to say about our families, but I really love that story. We're kind of going long on time. I don't know if I should tell one more story. I'm not going to get into my obsession with flying saucers as a child, but I will. I'll tell one more Thanksgiving story, and then we'll wrap it up. And that is not as heartfelt as yours was. And we had cottages up in Door County when I was growing up in Wisconsin, and Door County is the finger of Wisconsin. And it was somebody's big idea to go up to Door County for Thanksgiving, which, that's way up in Wisconsin, and it's cold and snowy. And at this point, my parents were, I was just at home, and my youngest cousin was at home, but everybody else had flown the coop because they're much older. And so I remember driving up there in our car, and my mother had the turkey in a roasting pan, and, my aunt, she was the hostess with Moses. Anyway, so we get there, and she's showing us, I think it was her, I can't remember whose house it was in, but she showed us that there was this new self-cleaning oven. So we were going to cook the turkey in the self-cleaning oven, and she said, then we're going to, throw the lever or whatever she was showing us, and then and she put the turkey in there, and as she was explaining to us how the self-cleaning oven worked, she tripped the lead. She brought the lever over, and the oven went on to 500 degrees to self-clean with the turkey in it. Well, what were we going to do? You couldn't open it. My father said, well, let's just turn off the electricity and open it. So they tried that, and it wouldn't unlock. It was on a timer. The timer was not connected to whatever. And so we sat there, and for the first half hour, it wasn't so bad, but all of a sudden this smoke started billowing out of it. And so they opened the windows and the doors. And this is the end of November in northern Wisconsin. We all had our coats on, hats on, gloves on, cocktails were out. And it was fascinating to see this smoke come out. My father was a safety engineer, and so of course, he kept a good eye on it. So after 2 hours, the lever flipped itself, and we heard the thing power down. And my father, he never missed a meal. I think I told you guys on an earlier episode how he would eat all day long when he left for work and have many meals before he came home. So he said, "Well, let's see."
I would have loved to have met him. We would have gotten along great.
You guys would have gotten along great. And so anyway, so he said, "Well, let's see." The turkey was completely black, and there would be no gravy, which was a big thing in my family. The gravy, I was passed down making the gravy. I have to make gravy, and I can. And so they cut off, I don't know, an inch, or I don't know. I wasn't there when they were doing it, and they found out in the dark meat and some other places that was still okay. It was like it was deep fried or something, and it was actually pretty juicy. So we had that and everything else we had planned on. Yeah.
Rescued Thanksgiving.
Yes. And my mother, I think she said, "Well, I don't want one of those ovens for our house. It's okay for here." Anyway, I have one more story, but Bob wants me to tell this. It's really not related. You love this story? Well,
from the babysitting.
Yes.
I can't imagine.
This isn't the Wonderment story.
Tell the story.
Anyway, when I was a kid in the grocery store, there was the tabloids, and I learned to read at about 5. And my father took me, he did all the grocery shopping. And so he would take me, and I would see these articles, baby alien found, abduction, whatever. And I'm like, "What's an alien?" I sounded out the word, and he explained to me, he said, "Well, they don't exist." I thought, well, they have to exist. They're in these papers. It was filled with it. And so I would, at school, I was always asking the librarian for unusual things. And I asked her, I remember, for any books on aliens or UFOs and whatever. And I was pretty fascinated with it. And I think there was a couple movies that came out during that time. And so I was too young for them, but I somehow got to watch them anyway. So I was, I don't know, at this point, I had written many letters. We'd go away to camp, and I would always draw a little flying saucer, the ones you see that are with 2 lights or 2 windows on the little dome, and, the typical cartoon. And I would put that on my return address when I wrote my letters from camp. My parents, I had many dreams about aliens, and I would come into their room, and I had this recurring dream for years. I could draw it out so well that many years later, when I was asked to do a commission about dreams for an art center I was teaching at, I did this, my bedroom with the alien outside the bedroom window, not the alien, the flying saucer outside the window parked in our lawn, and the alien standing at the end of my bed. The alien in my dream never hurt me or anything, but I was terrified of him because I didn't know what that was. Anyway, as a result, my brother took one of those prints. He had it hanging in his office for 35 years because he knew all about the alien thing. I mean, I drove my family crazy. So I'm going to babysit next door. I'm about 11 years old, which, nobody lets an 11-year-old babysit for their kids anymore either, but I did. I was a good babysitter. And I'm walking, I went just next door, and I walked out our back door, and I would go to their back door, my next door neighbors, and I'm walking through the yard, and I look up, and oh my God, there's an alien ship. There's this white oval light hovering above our yards. And I'm like, oh my God, I knew they would come. I knew they were here. I knew it. So I come in the house, and my parents are sitting on the couch watching TV. And I said, "You have to come outside." I said, "There's an alien. There's a ship outside." My father said, "An alien or a ship?" I said, The ship is out there. It's a flying saucer. You can see it from the yard." And they're like, they looked at me. They didn't think I was deranged, but they definitely thought I was odd. They're like, "Go babysit." So I go out the door, I walk out the door, and it's still there. So then I come in and I start crying hysterically. "Please come outside. Please come see it. I wouldn't come tell you this if it wasn't really there." And so they got up off the couch. As I've mentioned, I was married to Captain. I was not married. I was the daughter of Captain Safety, so we didn't have a firearm, we didn't have a knife, we didn't have anything, pocket knife or anything. But there happened to be a handsaw leaning on we had a sort of a mud room going down to the basement. And so he picks up this handsaw because they believed me. Like, what was he going to do? Saw the aliens in half? I mean, was this going to be his weapon? And my mother grabbed the broom. And so here we go, walking an 11-year-old, my parents, my father with the saw, my mother with the broom, walking through the yard, and they see it. I said, see, it's there. I start crying. I said, I knew it. I knew they were coming. And my father, being very reasonable, said, there's got to be a logical explanation for this. And so with the saw in his hand, he walked towards the light. And my mother was like, Bob, I don't know if you should go. And he's like, there's a reason. There's an explanation for this. So he finally gets close enough to the light to see that it's the new street light they had put up. And the dome of the light, it was on a hinge, had swung down, and it was iridescent glass. So it was waving, and it was oval shaped, and it had a light behind it. And so it really did look like a flying saucer. And of course, he's waving the saw at me, and he goes, go babysit. Go on, you're late. Go. So I went and babysat. I did not tell the people I was babysitting for that I had just not seen a flying saucer. But anyway, so we were different kinds of kids. But so there are many more stories about the flying saucers. It just never ends. But for today, I'm going to end this. And I want to thank everybody for listening. Like us, follow us, make a comment. We love comments. Next time we're going to read comments. We're pre-recording this, so I don't know when this will come out. But thanks for being here. Thanks for my partner in crime.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Susie.
Love you. Bye for now, everybody.
Goodbye.
Thanks for listening. If you like what you're hearing, please share this with a friend and subscribe where you listen to podcasts. Please support our efforts through Patreon at TheKnifeWife, and for all Terzuola goodness, go to Terzuola.net. And remember, if you're not laughing, you're not living. Comments and questions can be made on Instagram at The KnifeWife Podcast or our Facebook group, The KnifeWife Podcast. And if you're a couple who work together and would like to be on our podcast, tell us about yourself with an email at eccentricsuz.com or terzuola.net.